Hey everyone, I'm Wife, co-producer and visual artist of the show. The art will make more sense next year. We'll keep you posted. I just wanted to let you know that the episodes published today are going to be the last ones for a few weeks. Thanks to the amazing response we've gotten for stories, we have a backlog of interviews to work on and a ton to do for the holidays. You can expect new episodes around mid-January. When we come back in 2019, there will be a format change. The show will still be focused on people and their relationships to religious communities they've transitioned from, but there are also going to be episodes about things like current affairs that are influenced by faith-based groups. My husband also found that some of the many apocalypse scares throughout recorded history are kind of hilarious, so we want to write episodes about those too. As far as the schedule, we plan on putting out an episode or a series of episodes once every week for 2 weeks. Then we're going to take a week off and repeat the process starting the next week. 2 weeks on, 1 week off. My husband wasn't kidding when he says he comes home from work and immediately jumps into production mode. My schedule being more flexible allows me to work on it during the day, and we both need a break if this isn't our primary source of income. That being said, thank you for your support. The show reached over 300 downloads on Thursday morning, and we're so moved by everything you've done to help promote the show. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review with a comment. And also, share the show with someone, if you can. For discussions and the most immediate updates, follow the show on Twitter at Outfold Podcast. Thank you all, and Happy New Year!
Welcome to Out of the Fold.
I have had issues with depression stemming back to high school. I went through therapy a few times as a Christian and a few times now as an atheist, and it's always helped a little bit more every single time I've done it. But really, I think one of the biggest moments for me in terms of my depression and really starting to get a handle on it was the moment that I realized I was no longer a Christian. Just kind of the freedom to be whoever I wanted to be, to make of life whatever I wanted to make of it. I didn't have, some invisible force that was supposed to guide my future. Some people don't like that idea, and I thought I wouldn't like that idea. But then when I was actually faced with it, it was a lot more freeing and a lot more positive than I thought it would be. I realized there was kind of hope on the other side, and that I didn't have to, work like this insane hamster to try to make the wheel go forward and be part of God's big plan. I could just create my own big plan for myself or my own small plan, whatever really worked for me. And I'm not some kind of brilliant, wealthy philanthropist or something now or anything like that, but it's given me the ability to just kind of take life at its own pace and really formulate a plan for myself for the future. And I've got a much clearer plan for myself in the future than I did when I thought God was going to write it all for me. And when you have that, it really helps. It helps so much for your mental health to be able to just be like, yeah, this is what I want to do, going forward. And these are the steps I'm going to take to get to that point. When you can clearly articulate to yourself what you want to do with your life, it means so much for you personally. And for anyone who is kind of maybe in those early stages of deconversion and they kind of have that general better sense of themselves, what I'd say is, it really just gets better from here. And it, that sense that you can really decide for yourself what your personal growth is. You don't have it dictated to you by someone else. And you can just kind of seize upon who you are And I would say, grab onto it and just tell it to go wherever you want it to go, because that's really what life should be about. Figuring out who you want to be, what you want to be, and learning how to, and then implementing those steps toward being that person.
That was Neil, a former Baptist missionary. He moved around a lot as a kid, and not just throughout the United States. Most of his life until his early 20s was spent surrounded by people who made frequent declarations of adamant devotion and projected images of living in righteous purity. Speaking with him answered many of the questions I've had for a few years, and at the end of the second part, I'll talk about some of the new questions that arose because of those answers. No church group, company, or individuals were contacted for comments about any of the content in this episode. All opinions expressed are strictly those of the ones expressing them. Our conversation began on a Sunday afternoon.
I was born in Memphis, and that's kind of its own story unto itself. My dad was in seminary at the time. He was about 3 or 4 months away from graduation. So that kind of gives you an idea of sort of the environment I was raised in right there.
Yeah.
We were only there in Memphis for maybe 2 or 3 years. And then we moved to Illinois. That was where my dad had got his first pastorate. And just a few months before we moved there, my younger sister was born. So, I mean, she really has no memory of Tennessee at all. She was maybe 6 months old when we made the move. We moved to a little tiny town in Illinois. Its claim to fame is it's the hometown of Stephen Ambrose, the author of Band of Brothers. And we went to a small Southern Baptist church. That's where my dad was preaching for a couple years. And then he got ran off. I don't really know all the details behind it. And we moved to another small town. It was even smaller. It was pretty close to Eastern Illinois University. And stayed there a couple years, got run off again, moved to a little town not far from Springfield. And as my dad was getting run off there, in the meantime, he had gone on a couple of short-term mission trips. He had been to, I think it was Kazakhstan and Bulgaria, and he got the bug. So my parents began the process of becoming missionaries overseas with the Southern Baptist Organization. And they, after about a year, they got the call. They were going. They were good to go. They had a date to go start training, and it was right about that time that my dad got run off from that church too. So it worked out pretty easily. There didn't have to be any kind of awkward resignation procedure. It just left.
Wow.
We went to Virginia for the training. Lasts about 6 weeks. And then in the interim, we moved to Florida, where my dad's parents were. Actually, all my family is from Florida originally. And we lived with my grandparents for a few months, kind of in between training and when we actually left. We left in January 2003, went over to Indonesia, and ended up only being there for about a year and a half. When we were supposed to be there 2 years, there was some kind of weird training issue or something, and they didn't like it. It was in a kind of a period of transition for them because 2003. That's when Islamic terrorism was really starting to come kind of to the fore. That those first couple years after 9/11, it was a really big deal to anyone who was doing anything internationally, especially involving an Islamic country like Indonesia is.
Right.
So we had come back. We were doing some different training, and we were supposed to be back for 6 months before going back long term. And then the Indian Ocean tsunami happened that December. It was 2004. And so they were just like, nope, never mind. Come back. We need everyone we can get. The Aceh province had just gotten absolutely destroyed by this tsunami, and the Southern Baptists, the UN, every NGO that was operating in the entire country was sending everyone they could because it was such a massive disaster. I think it was something like 500,000 or 600,000 people were killed, and over 1 million were missing. I mean, it's one of the largest disasters in human history, and certainly in modern human history. And so they were just trying to get anyone they could to get there. And I actually went there in 2004 myself, or 2005, and it was kind of strange because when I went in March of 2005, 6 months earlier, it would have been illegal for me to step foot in that province. Aceh is one of these provinces in Indonesia that's kind of autonomous as a result of these little bits of fighting and civil war, which actually ended as a result of a tsunami. And they actually had imposed Sharia law in that province. So for anyone who wasn't Muslim, it was not legal to enter that province. So I was walking around in this kind of like actually forbidden land. They had just suspended Sharia law because it was the biggest natural disaster in modern human history, and they didn't have a choice.
Yeah.
And getting to experience that was really something. I mean, that was life-changing for me. I sometimes, I wonder if that was kind of the first moment, the first little switch that flipped in my path toward deconversion. Because I'm going around. I remember we're driving in from the airport, and we had to take a highway that was by the coast to get to the house that they had bought for us. And I was looking around at these coastal villages right where the tsunami had first come in, and it was just completely desolate. I'd never seen anything like that before. And I remember saying, as we were riding along in the car, I said, this must be what it looked like in Hiroshima and Nagasaki right after the bombs went off. Because it was you just saw flat land and just building materials scattered everywhere. I mean, that was it. There was nothing else. The only things that were left standing in the coastal areas were the mosques themselves. And the reason for that is the mosques are all built by financial collaboration. So they could afford to build them correctly, basically.
Wow.
They were, they had reinforced rebar and things like that. So the buildings were properly reinforced against the forces of a tsunami or something like that. And I mean, this was a tsunami that at its peak was 100 feet deep. And that was all that was left. I mean, that was the only thing that could even stand under all that water.
Wow.
But yeah, that was kind of the first experience for me where I was just like totally in shock and taken aback by what the natural world could do. And that was also kind of my first experience with people who had legitimately lost everything that they had, everything they knew, everything they loved. I mean, they had to just completely reboot their lives from start to finish. And these were people who in some cases were in their 40s, their 50s, who had completely lost, everything that was familiar to them. And seeing that kind of desolation and seeing what the world was really like in that way was really trying for me. I'm at that point I'm 14 years old, I think, and it's a really formative time anyway. And to have that kind of experience at that age is really something else.
So was it the destructive, the destruction that you saw, was that what it was that actually made you sort of start to question it? Or was there something about being there at that time, people that you met, or something that kind of put that first seed of doubt in your head?
The destruction was part of it. The one thing that really got me was this was a mansion that the organization had bought, because they were expecting to have probably 30 to 40 people at any given time coming through, and they didn't want to have all these houses all over the place. They wanted it to be organized. So they bought this it was a mansion, okay? It had like 8 or 9 bedrooms.
Mm.
It was the biggest house I'd ever been in my life. And So they had to have full-time household staff because everyone was out all day doing stuff.
Right.
I was out doing stuff. I mean, I was out helping test wells to make sure that the saltwater content had gone down. I'm out there at 14 years old, doing this stuff, checking to see if wells were ready to be rebuilt and that kind of thing in the 90-degree weather.
Right.
So they had to hire full-time help, and it was local help. And my mom had heard the story of one of the household help, his own encounter with the tsunami. So this guy was one of the few guys who lived in the coastal village who was not a fisherman. And because the gender roles in Indonesia are pretty different, he happened to be in the local the market that day, getting food for the week. And he said he's there, shopping for food, and all of a sudden there's this water that just comes through, and he's like, oh my God, what do I do? And he ran up into one of the buildings because in the city proper, Banda Aceh, there's all these buildings. They call them rucos, which is a portmanteau of the words rumah and toko, which are house and store. So you'll have a shopkeeper who will have a store kind of in the bottom level or the bottom two levels, and then live in like the third, fourth, and fifth floors of this building. So everyone in the store just goes upstairs. Owner opens the doors and gets everyone up into his house. And they sat there and waited for the tsunami to pass. So he goes back after the tsunami, it recedes, and his village is gone. It's just completely gone. There's nothing left of it. He can't find people. He can't find buildings. He doesn't even know which street is which because it's all just so completely destroyed. And they never found his family.
Wow.
So this guy goes into town to go grocery shopping and comes back to his home gone, his family gone, doesn't know where any of it went. And that was just like, that was the one story that really stuck out to me because it was the first one I'd heard. And I just I couldn't even fathom that. I mean, that was just completely outside my capacity to understand.
Yeah.
It just, it really shakes you, especially when you're learning about someone's experience with loss like that at 14.
Right.
And just seeing, again, what the world is capable of doing. A couple big rocks flip against each other, and next thing you know, thousands of people don't have a family anymore.
Right.
I mean, it's just, even now, I'm 27, almost 28 years old, and even now that boggles my mind to think about. I can't even imagine what I would do. So there in Aceh, I was there only a few weeks, but in total, time I spent in Indonesia was about 6 years. Most of it on the island of Sumatra, very southern tip. And actually, I went back there about 2 years ago, and I had some vague recollection of where I was, but the city itself has just changed so radically. It's pretty difficult to recognize if you weren't sitting there the whole time. But not long after I left to come back for college, my parents moved to another city, and that's where I'd gone back when I had gone back to visit them. It was, wherever they were at the time. They moved. They've actually moved twice now since they first went over there, and they're probably going to stay in the city there until they retire. It'd be kind of pointless at this point. They're both in their early 60s, and they're going to have to retire at 65.
Right.
So.
Right. So
I don't see a move coming for them.
Yeah, probably not. So what were the main things that you were doing over there? I know that you just sort of described that, just sort of helping out as you can, and, and then I'm sure there were things that you were doing that were directly associated with the church itself, and probably most of it was, but what was kind of your day to day?
So it was mostly my dad who was doing stuff, and kind of the MO changed from periodically. It just kind of depended on what was possible. But most of the time, there had been this program that the government had instituted where they were trying to get native speakers to teach the local teachers the English language.
Mm-hmm.
They wanted to start incorporating more English into not just English classes, but into other classes. They saw that as kind of a way to make Indonesian graduates more competitive in the global marketplace. And so my dad did quite a bit of that because he was one of the only people in the city who was actually a native speaker of English. And it's kind of weird because this was a city of like 800,000 people, and somehow we were one of like 10 families who were from an English-speaking or really any kind of Western country. And so that was kind of his inroad. He was teaching English and working with the local school boards and the provincial education department, kind of in an advisory capacity. He was also kind of having to learn how to teach as he went, so he could help them develop education plans and things like that, rather than just teach them English and just kind of leave it at that.
Yeah. So what? You said that you were doing that for about 6 or 7 years. How old were you when you left?
So I left when I was 18 for my freshman year of college.
Gotcha.
And yeah, that's kind of a pretty good segue into the next chapter, I suppose, because this is where sort of my involvement with the Southern Baptist Convention really increases, strangely enough. Let's see. So the original plan when I first started college was I was going to go to Christian college for a year. I really wanted to go to the University of Florida. But I was going to go to Christian college for a year, and then I was going to probably transfer to the University of Florida. And the whole thinking behind it was, that way he'll have a good Christian foundation to, prepare him for the evils of the outside world.
Yeah.
In retrospect, it was completely backwards. If I was going to go to Christian college in the first place, I should have started at a community college and worked my way into it. Because the fact is, a lot of Christian colleges are very small, and their standards are, strangely enough, a lot more rigorous than a state college is.
Yeah.
And when you're coming from a background of having been homeschooled since you were in kindergarten, that doesn't go over very well. It was a big adjustment, a very big adjustment, and I did not respond well to it. It was and making matters worse was the fact that my parents were only there for a semester, and just kind of left me to my own devices for my second semester of college. I'm still, barely figuring out how to, put together a schedule. And my parents are just like, you got it. I was like, I'm not so sure. I actually remember I had to pull over at one point that the first night going back, because I broke down crying. I mean, I didn't even know what I was doing. I didn't know how to handle myself, how to manage my life at all.
Mm-hmm.
I had no clue how to function. And, my parents just like, hey, bye, see ya.
Yeah.
And I'm stuck in this country I haven't really had any connection with for the past 6-7 years.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to kind of find my way in this situation. I mean, not that it would have made any difference, but I didn't have any friends at this school. I didn't really know anybody. And it really wouldn't have made a difference where I went to school, because that still would have been the case. But I just felt like totally out of my element, totally alone, totally lost, totally helpless, and I didn't know what I was doing. And perhaps unsurprisingly, I got pretty much all D's and F's that semester. Not a shocker there, I suppose. And my parents were like, okay, we need to have you come back over here and try to get your grades back on track.
Yeah.
So I went back over to Indonesia. My parents had just moved, and I stayed with them for that whole fall semester all the way into January. And sure enough, I did online classes and I got all A's. So it's funny, what a support network can do for you.
and that was probably the last time I had a semester that was all A's, because I went back and I still wasn't prepared. I just didn't have people around me, you know. I didn't have family, I didn't have friends, I didn't have a whole lot of real support there. And, you know, I got to know some people after I went back, and I got kind of ingratiated into a friend group, but a lot of them had very different paths for themselves. They were all in different majors from mine. So there really wasn't anything there to kind of help, you know, build accountability and build the ability to have like a schedule and to kind of plan things out in advance and all of that. I was still kind of stuck in this, you know, day-to-day mentality and not really knowing, you know, what the next step is going to be.
Right.
So I was still, you know, I was still not succeeding in class. I was still not succeeding in life in general. And a couple of years after that was when I finally got my first job. I was trying to think. I would have been about 21 at the time, working for the food service wing of the school, and that really didn't help either because they weren't very good at organizing themselves. So, I mean, how am I going to learn? You know, the blind leading the blind.
Right.
So, and that didn't last particularly long because I'm sitting there thinking, I don't even know how I'm going to get my schedule every week. I can't go traipsing all around campus just to find my schedule, you know.
Yeah.
It's just not really going to work. And I got a kind of a short-term job working at about 20 minutes from there. They were expanding for seasonal traffic because it was in this kind of little kitschy mountain town. It's actually not far from where they filmed Deliverance. And
Really?
So it turned into like this little enclave where all the rich people in Atlanta had all their vacation homes. They go up to where Deliverance was filmed. They do this all the time. And because it wasn't long after I started working at in 2012, this would have been, that I feel like I kind of hit the point of no return. And this is 2 years before I really had the moment. And the reason that I feel like it was kind of irreversible from that point was completely contrary to how people in Christianity had treated me up to this point. I was working with people who just kind of took me on my own merits. They were not judgmental. They were not weirded out by my occasionally awkward presence. They didn't have any kind of, you know, prejudice or anything like that about me. I went in there, I worked hard, I did what was asked of me and then some, and that was enough to be respected, and that was enough to be part of the group. I didn't have to have something born into me to be a part of what was going on there.
Yeah.
And on top of that, pretty much everyone I worked with was not religious. My bosses were all irreligious, and pretty happy to tell you that. I had one of my regular coworkers who was scheduled with me most of the time. She was openly lesbian, didn't have a problem telling anyone that. And this is in a small conservative town, for what it's worth.
Right.
They didn't judge me. They didn't have any problem with me. They respected me, treated me as an equal, welcomed me in spite of the fact that we had completely different religious views.
Right.
And that was something I hadn't experienced with people who had the same religious views.
Yeah.
I was like, this is crazy. It doesn't make any sense. You're not supposed to like me. You're not supposed to be okay with me. And yet here they were, totally fine with me. It was the first time in my life, at 21 years old, the first time in my life I found acceptance in a group of people, not just from one person, which is fine. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being accepted by just one person, but it does a lot for your mental health to be accepted by a group. And it was a place where I was valued, where my contributions were valued. Things I said, things I did were accepted and valued. I felt like I mattered for the first time ever. And, you know, when you kind of hit that point
with a group that's so wildly different from who you've been around all your life, it has an impact on you. And it's something where, you know, I listen to Seth Andrews, and he talks occasionally about how it's okay to have reasons that aren't, you know, transparently rational for leaving Christianity or leaving a religion. And I would definitely say my reasons, sure, I had my rational reasons, my logical reasons, and they existed, but what really pushed me over the edge was completely emotional. And I don't have a problem with saying that. You know, there's a lot of people who just excluded me from everything. And I mean, what am I supposed to do? Just be okay with the abuse? You know, it doesn't really make any sense. To me, it's just like, you know, what am I supposed to do? Just be okay with it? Just take it, and well, God will make it all right in the end. I mean, that's pretty small consolation.
Yeah. So what did they treat you poorly for? I mean, if you don't mind sharing. I mean, when you're talking about the fact that they treated you when you were around Christians, you know, they treated you like you were weird, and they didn't accept you based on your own character or your merits. I mean, what was it about you that caused them to treat you that way?
Well, when it came to being, you know, on the mission field, and this is kind of intersecting with some of the stuff I did directly with the Southern Baptist Convention, was the kids had cliques. And the way that their cliques worked was there weren't jocks and nerds and the weird kids and, you know, the classic social groups in high school. The cliques in the mission field were, the longer you've been on the mission field, the cooler you are.
Mm.
So, I mean, my parents had barely gotten their 5-year pins when I left. So, I mean, I was nobody.
Yeah.
I mean, I was around kids who'd been there since they were born, okay, at my age. So I had no way of competing with that for cool factor. It was always going to be an uphill battle.
Right.
And somehow, I don't know how, but the Southern Baptist Convention and their missions organizations just had never heard reports of this happening, which, after talking with other people who had been in kind of similar situations to mine, you know, I found out pretty quickly my experience was not unique. It was pretty typical. So I was kind of sitting there just like, oh my God. I mean, you know, when I found out that what they call it member care, had no clue that this was going on, I was just like, you know, when I actually sat down with some of their psychologists, I was just like, how did you guys not even know about this? I mean,
right.
It should be almost obvious. You should just about expect it. When you have a ceremony dedicated to pins for how long missionaries have been in the field, you should expect their kids to use that as an excuse to be, you know, jerks.
So what, you said that at one point you started to question it, you know, you had that seed of doubt. I mean, what was that, in the time that you were still in Indonesia, were you questioning it a lot? Like, were you skeptical and, questioning what you believed, or did you kind of just ignore that and then, you know, think about it later on?
Well, at first, you know, being all of 11, 12 years old,
right.
I wasn't questioning a whole lot, even though I've always been a very skeptical person. I think I get that from my mom. She's a very skeptical person, and you know, I've actually, in my conversations with her, because I'm much closer to my mom than I am my dad, you know, I've noticed some things that kind of make me, you know, raise an eyebrow. Nothing that really gets me thinking that she's not actually a Christian anymore. But, you know, she says some unusual things for an evangelical Christian. But I've always been very skeptical, and I guess when you're exposed to a culture that's so radically different from your home culture, and exposed to a religion that's different from yours, but just a little bit,
you start to ask questions naturally. I mean, it's going to happen,
Mm-hmm.
especially when you're someone who is as questioning a person as I can be. And I actually studied the Quran all the way through at one point, to try to understand Islam a little better. And I certainly came away understanding Islam a little better, but it left me with more questions about my own faith than I had before.
Right.
Because I'm sitting there, I've just gone through this book, and wow, this Allah guy, he's a little different from God, right? But at the same time, it's pretty hard to ignore the similarities.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not superficial ones either. And naturally you start to wonder, like, hey, what's going on here? I mean, how do we have this God who's so similar to the one I'm familiar with? And yet I'm supposed to believe he's radically different, and we have to go out and save everyone from this falsehood, this grave falsehood that's so very different from the truth. It's just like, it doesn't really make any sense.
Right.
Why is this one so bad and the sort of different one is perfect?
Right. So did that just make you think that different people have different names for God, but they basically are all worshiping the same thing? Is that sort of a conclusion you started to draw at that time?
A little bit. There was definitely the direction I was starting to lean toward. And while I was over there, we went to Thailand several times. So then I got to experience Buddhism up close, and that was something that was actually really different from Christianity and very different from Islam. We had code words for people who were members of other religions. And the reason that we used this was because the mission board itself had all kinds of security concerns. They were less concerned about their own people and more concerned about people like my parents who were overseas and working with nationals who were Christian. Because, the thinking went, worst case scenario, realistically, if something bad happens, our people get deported. I mean, big whoop. They're alive. But what's the worst that can happen to, a national Christian partner? They could be in prison, they could be killed, their families could be killed. There was a pretty realistic, security concern.
Yeah.
So they developed a coded language, not too different from the CIA's, actually. I already knew quite a bit of CIA lingo by the time I turned 18. I knew about, the company and using different operational phrases like that. The FTS, the short tenable statement for why you were there, things like that. But for every religion, there was a different code word. So, for example, the Muslims are cousins. They're similar to Christianity, but not a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Not similar enough, I guess you might say. And Buddhists were buddies. And those kinds of distinctions, too, also very much colored how I came to learn about these different religions and how I saw them while I was still a Christian. And it very much impacted the way that I kind of interpreted everything I was seeing. Not in a negative way per se, but just that, it made me realize there are religions out there that are similar to Christianity, just like there are religions out there that are very different from Christianity.
Definitely.
And getting to experience both sides of that coin was very instrumental, I think, because you start to see, things aren't really all that different on the other side.
Right.
Even when the mask of the religion itself is different.
So how did talking to Muslims have an impact on you at the time?
I began to realize that, first off, that Muslims were like actual people and not scary monsters.
Right.
Like at the time, the American media had essentially been telling me to think.
Yeah.
it was not a good time to be a Muslim in 2003 in the U.S.
Right. Yeah.
But you know, I go out and I would meet these people, and you know, they were totally cool with, you know, this Christian American guy being there. It didn't scare them. So I thought to myself, you know, why should I be scared of them if they're not scared of me? You know? And you also got to understand that just like I had misconceptions, and people who were sort of from my group had misconceptions about Muslims and about Muslims living overseas, they had their own misconceptions about Americans and how Americans lived. Some of them very transparently comical, such as the belief that everyone's got a gun and, you know, is in car chases every day.
Right. Yeah.
Which, to be fair, maybe isn't so far removed from reality.
Depends on where you look.
But they also had much more benign misconceptions, and you know, these ideas of how Americans were that weren't necessarily so ridiculous, but were still wrong.
Mm-hmm.
You know, things like you know, the belief that pretty much everyone in America is a Christian, which, you know, even now, as someone who's not religious, I can very clearly see that's not the case.
Yeah.
There's quite a few people in America who aren't religious. And actually, I remember listening to David Silverman when Seth Andrews interviewed him a couple years ago. David Silverman said, and then I went and looked it up and found out he's right. I mean, he said he can defend the statistic that 1 in 4 Americans is not religious. Mm-hmm. And I went and looked at the numbers that Pew does, and I was like, wow, he's right. I mean, I could defend it too. It's not hard. You know, you look at the numbers, and you have to be able to kind of parse it out. You have to look between the names and see what it really is when you go down to its core elements. You see, you know, it's like 3 or 4% are atheists, and then there's 9 or 10% that are agnostics, and then there's, you know, 11 or 12% that's spiritual or secular none. That's a popular one now. Mm-hmm. I'm like, okay, but these are all the same thing. You don't believe in a God. People think atheism is this worldview, and I'm like, that's just something that you know, Christians have kind of created around atheism. It's this belief that, you know, because Christianity is a worldview, therefore atheism must be a worldview.
Right.
And I'm like, I meet atheists all the time who could not be any more different from me.
Yeah.
If you think we have the exact same worldview, oof, you're in for a surprise.
Yeah, and also, I mean, when you talk about going to a Christian college, so I went to a Christian high school, but I was raised Quaker, which I only found out recently is weird. That I would have Quaker parents that would want to send me to a Christian school, but you know, I was taught that if you basically, I was taught in the Christian school, not with Quakerism, but in the Christian school, they taught that if you believe anything other than you know, the Trinitarian view of Jesus is the body of God, and you know, that whole way of thinking, then if you believe anything else, then you're basically worshiping the devil.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and my parents definitely had that same view. I mean, they had this belief that, you know, for example, that they had the whole Obama's a closet Muslim thing going on for a long time because he was a member of the Unitarian Church. So
right.
They were like, well, you know, Unitarianism is not really that different from Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, now I look at that, I'm just like, what?
Yeah. those aren't even the same coin. Huh. So, what was the college that you went to? If we could move forward to that again, the
Sure.
college that you went to, was it the type of place where they just tried to incorporate religious teachings into everything? Like for me, it was whenever we took a test, we would pray before it every single time, and do things like that. Was it similar to that, or is it different in a university setting versus a grade school setting?
It was a little different. So I've been to 2 different Christian colleges at this point.
And they had some similarities in their approaches, but there were also some pretty big differences. So the first one I went to is a little tiny Christian college in Northeast Georgia. That really doesn't narrow it down, so I'm not too worried about getting doxxed or anything.
Okay.
It was they would have chapel several days a week. You had to like go to a certain number, so it was like you started at 0 and worked your way up, and it was a class technically, but it was so weird the way it worked. When you went to class, like a normal class, there would be a prayer at the beginning. There'd be prayer requests. So in that way, it was very similar, I think. Even though I didn't go to a Christian high school, from what I understand of Christian high schools, that much of it was very similar to the Christian high school experience, that whole part of it. If you had been to a Christian high school and then sat in on one of these classrooms, the first 5 or so minutes of class would not be any different to you.
Okay.
It's after that point that you start to diverge, and the experience became a lot more academic, and it wasn't a lot of constant, drill into your skull indoctrination. Things started to shift pretty dramatically after that point. So it was like, and this is especially true at the second college I went to, the Southern Baptist one. There was a very clear attempt at sort of splitting basically the academic and the religious parts and not letting them interfere or intermingle too much. Obviously, at certain points where appropriate by their standards, the religious stuff would enter in. But it's not like we were doing word problems in math classes with Jesus had 5 loaves and 2 fish, But, we used actual mainstream textbooks. Some of the textbooks I've used in my college classes, people at state schools use.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I was like, even as I was starting to kind of lose grip on my faith, I was like, this isn't so bad. This isn't so weird.
So, and you mentioned that you had to go to a certain amount of chapels. Was that like throughout a semester they gave you a certain amount that you just had to attend? Right.
So at that first school, the chapel was 3 days a week.
Okay.
And when I first was going there, the fourth day was supposed to be, it had some name for this, but it was basically like a small group thing. And some of the groups were very good at actually meeting, and others were not. And so it could become very difficult to pass chapel in a 16-week semester when you're required to attend, I think it was 60, if your group didn't meet every week. Because you start doing the math. It's like, how do I get enough chapels to pass? And that actually caused me to change the policy on chapel. So it became 4 days of chapel every week while having the same required number. So now you had 4 chapels every week, and it was 56 that they required you to attend. So that made it a lot simpler, because then you could end up skipping 2 whole weeks and still pass.
So I ended up going to a community college when I was in my mid-20s. I didn't go to college right after high school. I did not care about high school at the time. I got, I don't honestly at this point know how I passed, but I did really well in community college. And what you're describing sort of reminds me of a science class that I took. I think it was biology. No, it was a chemistry class. I took a chemistry class, and there were required lab hours. There were required things that you had to do with that. And if you didn't do that, then they would dock your grade. Was it like that, where it was like if you didn't go to chapel, then I guess the specific professor that was leading it would give you a lower letter grade?
Yeah. So, well, it was really weird because the way the chapel worked was you had to have a chapel for all but 2 semesters of your time, or you wouldn't graduate. So they couldn't just fail you, because then they'd have this huge backlog of people who would never graduate because they'd be spending 2 extra years making up all their failed chapels.
Right.
So you would do the chapel, and it would be a pass-fail grade. And then if you failed, you could pay a fine with certain number of I can't remember, it was something like $10 for each chapel you missed. And then if you paid that fine, then they would just switch it to a pass. Or you could write a 2-page essay, and the person in charge of chapel would give you a topic to write the essay about, and then they would grade that. And if you got better than a C, then you passed chapel. So obviously, if you're smart, what you do is you just never go to chapel, and then you just write a decent 2-page paper, and you don't have to worry about chapel anymore. So then they changed that policy after a couple years of me being there, and they made it so you had to pay the fine in order to get the grade reverse. But I was pretty bad about chapel and pretty bad about class in general, seeing as at that point in my life, like I said, I had no concept of how to schedule a day. I mean, none. I had no way of knowing how to organize my time. I had no way of knowing what I was doing. And so obviously I had all kinds of issues there. The thing that really was interesting about that school, though, was just off campus, there is this house that you could live in if you were a missionary kid, and you would get to live there for free if you did chores around the house. And I did that a couple of summers. And that was its own experience, because that was kind of where I saw how the sausage is made in terms of like American Christianity and American evangelicalism in particular.
What were they doing? What were some of the things that you saw?
Well, the kids of the people who were running each of the houses, there were 2 houses up there on the hill, they were out, having sex and everything else. They were being normal, 18 to 25-year-olds. And, I'm sitting there as I slowly began to peel back. That was when I first started to be like, hey, what's going on here? Like, I'm depriving myself of all these experiences at this point in my life, and these people are out there going out there, and they're all like, oh yeah, I'm going to heaven and all this stuff. What's really going on here? And I began to kind of pry a little bit at people I knew at the school who were not, part of the missionary kid community, I guess you might call it. And I was finding out they were doing all that stuff too. And that's when I was like, okay, what am I doing? Everyone else is out here having fun, and I'm sitting here, alone in my room all the time. And honestly, in retrospect, I can say this pretty confidently now. Now that I have had some of those experiences, if I had gone to a state school, I probably would still be a Christian. Because at a state school, I would have done those quote-unquote mistakes. I would have had sex in the parking lot, or I would have smoked weed or something. And I would have been like, oh, my God, I've done something so horribly wrong. And I would have had some kind of emotional reason to be thrown back into it.
Right.
And to never ask any more questions. To just do what I was told and to follow the rules. But I never had those experiences at Christian college. I never had a reason to stop questioning, because all that stuff, the weed, sex, the rock and roll, all of that was so off limits, and I stayed away from it. And so it was all theoretical. None of it was real. It was all just things that I knew were out there, like a stack of $1 million in cash. But I'd never seen it, never experienced it, never tasted it, smelled it, nothing. I had no sensory connection to it. And so I had no reason to stop questioning. I had no reason to stop pushing the envelope further and further.
Right.
And I know it sounds kind of silly for me to say pushing the envelope while I'm sitting here talking about, I was definitely very much a virgin at 21 years old who had never smoked weed, and my only experience with alcohol at that point was accidentally drinking communion wine. But I was pushing the envelope in other ways, outside of that, ways that you're only going to think about when you don't have those experiences and when you haven't made those quote unquote mistakes.
So when the way that you put this, when you learned this was like you found out almost like the true nature of evangelicalism, if you want to put it that way. And is it kind of your opinion that that's what's actually happening in the back rooms of most evangelical, communities? Like, I don't know if you've actually seen it firsthand, and I don't want to, put it out there that I'm setting up a conspiracy theory that is what's going on. But have you actually seen firsthand that is what is happening, or was that sort of an isolated incident?
Well, that made me start asking questions about what was really going on. I was like, am I living like a normal life, or have I just dropped into, Wonderland or something? So that's when I started trying to kind of put out feelers with people I knew from the missionary days, because some of them were finally starting to like grow up and realize, hey, I'm not special for having been in Indonesia for 15 years.
Yeah.
It doesn't make me a better person than anyone else. And some of them had started to kind of, message me, trying to talk, just kind of, trying to start some conversations. One of them, he's actually himself an atheist. He was the first person I knew who I told. And I asked him kind of pointed questions because I knew it would be safe to talk to him about anything like this. And he was like, oh, yeah, I mean, that stuff's just totally normal. You should expect to see that anywhere, that there's like an evangelical community. And it was kind of funny because when I was asking about this, I was still kind of a Christian, and he was already like an open atheist, even to his missionary family. And so it was kind of an interesting experience to meet someone who had been on both sides and was now going to be totally comfortable with the idea of talking to me about it, and sort of like walking through the kinds of things that I should expect to see. And really, I mean, that school had all kinds of other real issues. It was bad. That school's a mess. I'm amazed they're still open, to be honest. They had a president who embezzled like $6 million at one point. And, I mean, a school of 800 students, come on. It's amazing they didn't go bankrupt.
Yeah.
Let's see, there was what was his actual title? I'm trying to remember what his actual title was. But at one point, he was like the dean of the School of Biblical Studies. He was having these mentoring relationships with female students. And let's just say the mentoring part might as well have been a euphemism for something else. Let's see, what else was going on? I mean, it was just a total mess. When I realized that, it was the students, it was the faculty, it was the staff that was all doing all this stuff that I was supposed to not be doing, I was just like, this is nuts. I mean, what am I doing here?
Yeah.
And all that, learning about all that and having all the struggles that I had up to that point, I was just like, I got to get out of here. I got to go somewhere else. And that was what led me to transfer ultimately to the Southern Baptist School. And then I found out it really doesn't make a difference where you're at. Everyone else is still out having fun while telling you not to have any.
In the next episode, I propose a theory based on Neil's experiences, and he goes more into his current personal views. For more information about the religious breakdown of the United States, keep listening until the end of part 2. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. Most importantly, share the show with someone you trust. Talk soon.